Welcome to the Passive House podcast, brought to you by Passive House Accelerator, a catalyst for zero carbon building. For news, inspiration, and connections from all flavors of Passive House, check out passivehouseaccelerator.com. Sign up to receive regular updates about events, get your technical questions answered, and contribute to the community forum. There's loads of free information for experienced professionals and people just starting out on their Passive House journey. We hope to see you at one of our construction, tech, or weekly Global Passive House Showcase webinars. In the meantime, here's this week's Passive House podcast. Welcome back to the Passive House podcast. I'm Matthew Cutler-Welsh, coming to you from Auckland in New Zealand.
And I'm Zack coming to you from smoky Seattle.
Smoky Seattle. You're on the couch. You've been relegated back to the couch, Zack.
I have been, because my office, I took my air monitor sensor dealy bob to the office today, and it realized that it was quite dangerous air in that little office. There's no filtration or ventilation to speak of, and it was yucky and not safe. So I had a little video thing I needed to do, and then came home, where it's not unsafe, but not great air inside. But we have 3 air purifiers running full blast right now to clean out the air from all the wildfire smoke.
Yeah, which is kind of an incredible situation to be in, where it's officially unhealthy. And I've just had a look at the airnow.gov website, which I didn't know existed, but is incredible source of information showing all of the PM 2.5 sensors anywhere that they exist. And zooming in on the Seattle area, there's a lot of red and purple dots, which are not good.
No, it impacts a lot of stuff. I mean, my son had a soccer game on Sunday, and by then, actually, so we've been dealing with kind of on and off bad air for the last couple of weeks, because we've been socked in for that long, and sometimes the wind is blowing the right direction to get rid of it for a little bit, and then it comes back. And on Sunday, it was actually fairly clear, but my son had been dealing, there had been yucky air or moderately yucky air during the soccer practice a couple of days before and stuff, and he had to stop playing because he couldn't breathe. He was just like, he just wasn't able to run at all because of this.
Scary.
And then it was scary. Then the next day, he had a practice, and it was clear air again. I mean, Sunday was actually not that bad, but it was just the lingering effects from a couple of days before. And he was okay the next day, just totally fine. So all of our bodies are just like kind of reeling from the impacts of this in our lives here, and things get, all sorts of stuff gets canceled when it's this bad. But yeah, it's really pretty gross.
And these fires, the fires aren't on your doorstep. You're not in danger of wildfires.
No, not at all. These are a couple hundred miles away, or 100 from, no, not a couple hundred. These are closer, but they're up in the mountains. Nowhere there, we're not threatened by fire at all here. Yeah. But we're getting this. The smoke is just blowing down the western face of the Cascade Mountains into the Seattle region, so. It's everywhere, and it's very visible. We can't see neighboring neighborhoods in Seattle. It's so choked up, and I was mentioning to you before the recording here that I was born and raised in this here, and it was never like this. Not until like a few years ago. This is a new phenomenon. So we're just thinking about resilience.
Your high infiltration buildings are allowing all of those particles to easily find their way inside the building, where, because you're a bit of a Passive House geek now, you have an air monitor, and you're able to tell exactly how bad the air is.
Yes, that's right. At the AQI right now inside our house right now, I think is not that bad. It's like 70, which is sort of not great air, but not like horrible air. At the office, it was well over 100. inside, which is bad.
Yeah.
Not as bad as outside, but it was bad.
Yeah.
No, it's definitely something that's top of mind. And now we're kind of in, I think for a lot of people inside with old houses that don't have good filtration, or ventilation that's with filters, which is what we need.
Yeah.
We close up all the windows and doors, and yes, it's a leaky house, but after you've closed everything up and you don't open anything at all, the CO2 levels go really high. So then it's like balancing, okay, do we deal with the PM 2.5 and open the doors and a little bit so we can get CO2 levels down, or do we and what are the long-term implications of those decisions? And so basically we're just tolerating, our CO2 level is well over 2,000 parts per million right now. So
wow.
If I'm not very sharp in the conversation, that's my excuse.
Dozing off. Yeah. That's wow. And you mentioned resilience, but that really literally brings it home to the ability of buildings. I mean, ideally you don't need to want to deal with these situations and being able to open a door to get quote unquote fresh air from the outside, but these situations where the air outside is not fresh or healthy, then our houses just aren't up to dealing with that.
Yeah, and it has really interesting implications for the whole conversation about the cost of passive house, because one of the key pieces of cost that of a passive house compared to a conventional building right now is the cost of the ventilation system, of an HVAC system.
Yeah.
And this is not about energy efficiency in Seattle right now. That's not what I'm thinking about. I'm just thinking about the health of our family and the ability to just function.
Yeah.
And that has no price tag. I mean, it does in reality, because we have to, because we want this to be accessible and health indoors to be accessible and equitably accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
So therefore it does have the price tag does matter, but it's not about some optional kind of thing at this point. When we have these episodes. So we need to make I think that a passive house has a couple of benefits. One is that it mitigates climate change because it reduces carbon emissions, but it also allows us to adapt to climate change. And clearly we need to be doing some adapting at this point. So,
absolutely. Yeah. Well, speaking of adaptation, I found a little article this week from a different part of the world. This comes from Scotland, and it was by an engineer by the name of Jamie Patterson, who is a senior engineer at a firm called Will Rudd Davidson. And he wrote a piece in Urban Realm, which is a Scottish newsletter for the architecture industry in Scotland. And so Jamie is he's an engineer. He's a structural engineer, has been for a while, but he recently did a passive house course, and became a certified passive house consultant, I guess. And it's a really interesting reflection on going to that course with his experience as a structural engineer and learning about passive house. And he starts off stating, making the case for the global impact of energy consumption of buildings, which around the world on average is about 1/3. And it's quite high in places like Scotland, where it's relatively cold climate. And just reading from the article, he says, as a structural engineer with a newly awarded certificate from the Passive House Institute, I'm even more convinced that this tried and tested international standard is the solution for Scotland being able to decarbonise new and existing buildings. And he goes on to say that as a structural engineer, he spent most of his time working on new buildings, and that's relatively easy, but sees that there's a really big opportunity for Passive House to help fix up existing buildings. He goes on to say Passive House is usually applied to new buildings, but considering that 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have already been built, we really must give as much attention, if not more, to retrofitting old buildings to reduce their carbon output. I've heard that quoted quite a few times, but I think it's really worth emphasizing that 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have already been built. And 2050 is often seen as that kind of that horizon that we're working towards, particularly from a net zero point of view, net carbon zero point of view. And if you think about 80% of the problem we're talking about there already exists, then that really does, well, it should focus our attention on those problems that exist, which are all of our existing buildings. So some really interesting perspectives there. He also highlights that there's a bit of momentum in Glasgow at the moment, probably as a result of COP26 being held there. And in closing, he says another exciting development this year, and this article just came out this week, October 2022. The largest passive house development program in Scotland is being developed for social rent. And he also says that the Scottish Parliament might soon be debating a members' bill that would require all new housing in Scotland to be built to passive house standards.
Wow.
So go Scotland.
Yeah, no kidding. Go Scotland is right.
I will put a link to that, and there's a couple of other interesting articles and bit of news out of Canada. There's lots of really, really cool passive house stuff going on in Canada. Seems to always pop up for me, but a nice little article there from this structural engineer in Scotland. All right. Well, we've got another great interview to get stuck into. So let's do a quick shout out to our sponsors.
Absolutely. So thanks to our founding sponsors, 475 High Performance Building Supply, Baxt Ingwe Architects, Glavel, Minitair All-in-One HVAC and Dehumidification Units, Mitsubishi Electric Train HVAC US, Partel, Rockwell North America, Stocorp, and Zola Windows. Thanks also to our champion sponsors, Icon Windows and Doors, Proseco, and Source 2050. And a big thank you to our stakeholder partner, NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority.
Awesome. All right. Thank you to all those people and, of course, to our listeners. If you haven't already, make sure you do subscribe, not just the podcast, but also to Passive House Accelerator newsletter for all news and events and information coming out on a weekly basis. Who are we highlighting this week?
Yeah,
Zack?
A very special guest, Lisa White, Associate Director of Phius. Lisa is a really amazing person, really smart and creative thought leader in the passive house space. She started, as you'll hear from our interview, she started just over 10 years ago as an intern at Phius, and quickly rose to her current role as associate director. She has done academic work around the relationship between super energy efficient buildings and the clean energy transition and the grid. And I think that's helping to inform some of the moves that Phius has been making in evolving their standard. Really fun to connect with Lisa in this conversation. I hope everyone enjoys the interview. And I'm also really excited to see Lisa and the crew in Chicago next week, but we'll talk more about that on the other side.
Quick jargon notes. Towards the end, you mentioned Qualified Allocation Program, or
yes.
QAPs. Yes.
So a QAP is there's a funding mechanism for affordable housing here called low income housing tax credits, or LIHTCs, and they are administered by housing authorities in each state. And the criteria by which these housing authorities award these LIHTCs to different projects, because it's a competitive process, the criteria is referred to as the QAP, or Qualified Allocation Program. Each state decides which criteria they will apply, and some states are using or have used passive house as a key criteria. So that's why
Nice.
that comes up. It's been that's what drove the rapid uptake of Passive House in Pennsylvania, for example, and in some other states, Connecticut and others have adopted similar policies.
All right. Well, enjoy the interview.
Well, I have Lisa White, Associate Director of Phius, here on the Passive House podcast. Lisa, it's such a pleasure to get a chance to chat with you. Thanks for being here.
And thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm a big admirer of your work and of your thought leadership in buildings and the clean energy transition, and the role that buildings can play to support this transition we need to see on the grid. And so I'm really looking forward to diving into all that with you. You've been at Phius for a decade now.
Yes.
And I'm sure a lot has changed during that time, both in terms of the Phius, the organization, as well as your role there. You're associate director now, but you got your start as an intern. So can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how did you connect with Phius to start with? And what has this journey been like the last 10 years?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, first off, it's like super grateful for the opportunity of finding Phius 10 years ago, 10 and a half years ago now. A kind of a weird journey. I heard about, I was in school in Champaign-Urbana at the University of Illinois and heard about Phius through a friend. Later learned that Kat was actually a guest lecturer in one of my lectures. I had notes, but I didn't really connect the two until after I joined Phius. But yeah. I started the summer right after undergrad as an unpaid intern. Kind of doing whatever Phius needed. Very different organization, pretty small in Urbana. Email, just looking for anything kind of in the efficiency and building space to kind of connect what I'd been studying in school. And I started with Ryan Abendroth, was the certification manager. We did have a certification department, but it was Ryan and myself as kind of an intern. Really did a bunch of odds and ends for the first year. And then Ryan was done with Phius and I got handed kind of the certification program about a year and a half after I started. So from then on with Phius, I was managing the project certification program, like 2013 to 2019, maybe. Took the CPHC training, kind of dove right in, really just loved the concepts. I've always been obsessed with efficiency, weirdly obsessed. And Passive House just made a lot of sense to me. And combined, what I did environmental sustainability and architecture in undergrad. So it really combined those topics really well. So I felt really grateful to find something that I was passionate about. I worked on training development. I quickly became a CPHC trainer, which was fairly intimidating at the age of 24.
Right.
But I did a lot of trainings for CPHC training, WFI passive modeling, kind of developed that curriculum and worked on that energy modeling tool. At some point we moved to Chicago one of those years. Phius did the office and we kept growing. Gained a certification team. James Ortega, then I handed off certification manager to him just a few years ago. And since then, Phius just keeps growing. So we, in a good way, but very much a building a plane and flight way, just, doing as much as we could with the resources we had. So we were at a point where we kind of needed to reassess all the things we were doing and get organized. And that's kind of been what I've been trying to do over the last 2-3 years with Phius, working with all the departments that we now have, training, product cert, project cert, alliance, policy, all the different things we're doing and trying to get these into kind of a centralized system to help us or to help facilitate us growing more. So I've done a lot of work with that and our central management, and then also our new website, our new databases and access to data through our portal. So very different, right. I was in the grind of working with project teams and providing feedback on energy models and building plans to website, and all that type of stuff.
Yeah.
So I've kind of been all around almost anything that you could think of with Phius I've been doing. So it's been fun. It's been really rewarding. And I love the new, our growth and all of our new employees. Our new team is great. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many employees are at Phius now?
Great question. I want to say 18 to 20. I can
Yeah.
never keep track. 18 to
Yeah.
20 full time. We've got consultants, we have trainers. So depending on how you slice it, I think we have
Yeah.
about that many. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's been great to see that growth. And I imagine that having that grounding kind of, I mean, 10 years ago, it was a very small organization. You were sort of involved in every element of the business, if you call it, or the organization, the institution. So that seems like a really great training then for the work that you're doing now. I mean, who
Definitely.
else there's a very small handful of people who have the kind of perspective that you have, I imagine.
Yeah, definitely. I learned so much by kind of just, diving in and needing to learn things. And yeah, I think that was a really good training. And I didn't mention, but like hit all the research department kind of as well. I was involved in the standards development and kind of seeing those implemented, and now learning from 2015 to 2018 to 2021, and getting just enough of the technical end to, keep my appetite. But
Yeah, that's awesome. So speaking of the technical end, not necessarily, well, I mean, both at Phius, but also in the broader question about how to realize this clean energy transition that we all need to so desperately, and need it so desperately, so quickly. I'd love to talk about the work that you have done in understanding and explaining the connection between deep building energy efficiency and the grid. I mean, this is something that I personally have been super interested in and concerned about for a long time, and so I've learned a lot from you and seeing your presentations over the years about this topic and your writing about this topic. So, and if your graduate work also touched on this, is that right?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
So, my graduate work was in energy engineering, and this is kind of what opened my eyes to some of these concepts. So it was fairly broad, and I learned about like power generation and how all that works, like on the grid, and then also utility markets. And I had that kind of side by side with the work we'd been doing at Phius, and kind of thinking about how does the work we're doing impact that, and how does the building, load on the other end of the grid impact the resource capacity needed for power generation and like the utility markets. And I kind of pondered and wrote a paper on like, what does net zero cost the grid? And it's interesting. It depends on the utility market. It depends on the pricing, and it depends on the building as well. And how the building is able to respond to when renewable resources are available, or if it's able to, shift load to utilize more PV or not. So yeah, I could talk about this for 7 podcasts, but really, I think that the two critical pieces for the transition to a clean energy future, at least what I can nail down, is that buildings need to have low loads and that they need to have flexible loads. So we're removing our dependency on generation resources that we can just say turn up, turn down whenever the building load changes. That's worked in the past. We have a lot of redundant capacity because of that, because we have to meet peaks. So as we try to remove our dependency and add all this intermittent renewable energy, buildings need to be more responsive to when energy is actually available or power is actually available. So that's one piece, with kind of the load flexibility, being able to shift that load to when the resource is available. And then the low load part of it's really important, because the peak or the load on the building is really what determines the amount of capacity needed in the infrastructure. So it's like a heating system. We size our buildings, to meet a peak load, and that determines the actual size of the system, right? It doesn't matter how long that system runs over the course of the year. That doesn't determine the size. It's the peak. So that's the same way with buildings. The peak is really what determines the capacity of the equipment that we need. So the lower we can keep the peaks, the less renewable infrastructure we need to actually meet those. And then if we can, move those peaks around or have smart loads in buildings, we can utilize more renewables and get off of fossil fuel based resources.
Yeah, I think just to underline for people who are listening that you're talking about a lot about loads, and I think that's what is so critical. Is this understanding about how vital loads are, load shifting is, and we're not necessarily talking about demand.
Right.
So, right, I mean, demand is important, but it's really when it comes to this clean energy future that we envision, and that is beginning to happen in real ways, which is awesome. It's those loads. How do we deal with, like, I think the term the dark doldrums, when it's dark in the winter and there's no wind and it's cold. What do we do with, how do we heat our buildings and power the rest of the grid?
Yeah. And demand in the power generation world is actually the peaks. So that was something I learned.
Yeah.
So they call demands like their peak. So you're talking about like annual energy consumption.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. And there's a shift to like timing. So the peak is more about timing, right? Like an hourly or, whatever minute peak. And the concepts that we're kind of promoting or that are being heavily adopted is net zero, which is an annual concept. I use this amount of energy annually and I offset this amount of energy annually. And it's a great step in the right direction, but it's like, we're going to need to do more than that. Or get more than the load. We need to reduce the loads first, then offset it with renewables if we want. But make sure those loads are flexible. And that to me is more important than having, maybe for resilience, you want the renewables on site, but there's some sort of balance. You need to make sure that low load building with flexible loads is at the core of everything.
Yeah. So how is that understanding shaping the certification and the work at Phius?
I would like to have a Phius GEB certification. So like a Phius Grid Interactive Building. It would be something starting with Phius Core and then allowing for flexibility in the loads and responsiveness in the loads. It doesn't have to be zero, doesn't need renewables necessarily. But it's kind of, that's some of the research that I'm getting into is how not just can the building help facilitate more renewables, but then how can those be integrated into resilient like microgrid communities that run solely on renewable energy or are connected to the grid at one point, but try to optimize within that community. For certification, I'm not sure we're close, but we're, I think it's possible in the next few years, maybe to at least incorporate some of these concepts into something that we can train constituents on, even if it's not a certification. The other thing is our Revive pilot for retrofits, which I won't get into much, but we'll think about the timing of energy use and kind of the emissions associated with that and incorporate that a little bit better than our existing certification program.
Cool. So when this episode airs, it will be the Monday of the week of the PhiusCon 2022 in Chicago, and I'm really looking forward to being there. And actually, all of the accelerator team will be in Chicago, and we're
awesome.
all super excited.
Yeah.
So we get to see you in person. So what are you most excited about this year at PhiusCon?
Yeah, I mean, I think every year has a really good technical program, and I'm a technical person, so I love like hearing all kind of the advanced solutions and everything that's happening. But I took another look at the program, and what I think is really cool is how focused yet how broad the program is. It's not just the energy nerds technical talking about, the compressors and heat pumps or something. It's super broad. There's policy, there's equity, there's, affordable multifamily solutions. There's just a ton of different things where people are coming at this from all different angles. So to me, it seems like it has broadened, and people are, finding all these awesome solutions to make passive building mainstream. So that to me is really exciting, that I feel like we're hitting greater audiences, and this has the ability to continue spreading in all these kind of different arenas. But I think what I'm most excited about, and maybe this is the same every year, is really just getting together. There's like something intangible about the togetherness of everyone and the inspiration. A lot of the people I'm seeing at these Phius conferences were the same people I saw 10 years ago at Phius conferences that originally inspired me and have kept me going in this community. And it's just like a total recharge. Like, we get stuck, especially me. I'm guessing many people in kind of the everyday grind, and it's hard to like zoom out and look at everything that's actually going on and recognize it and celebrate it. And that's what I'm really excited about at the conference. It happens every year. You just come away with this like incredible feeling. So that's what I'm looking forward to most.
Yeah, me too. And I mean, we're social animals. So getting off these 2-dimensional rectangular screens is really healthy.
It really is.
It'd be good.
There's something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. And also, I mean, you mentioned the diversity of the programming on at PhiusCon. Another thing I noticed was the bridge track. So there's something. So I am not a technical person, so that would have been a good track for me when I was first getting involved. Just the primer on the basics of passive house and passive building. So that it's gonna be fun. And also there's the PhiusCon Kids, the PhiusCon Youth.
Yeah, the PhiusCon Youth. That's
be fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm excited for that.
Yeah, me too. Cool. So another topic, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but I know you've been really involved in this effort, is the effort at ASHRAE around developing a passive building standard. I think I think that was an accurate way to depict it, called ASHRAE 227P.
Correct.
Could you say, maybe just a few words to introduce people to what that's about?
Yeah.
And where it's at, and how you're feeling about it.
Yeah, of course. So it's the ASHRAE 227P passive building standard. The scope is all buildings, so that's making it a little bit challenging. But all buildings, all types, all new construction and retrofit. So this came about. The first meeting was in person, so that tells you it was at least pre-COVID. It was in 2018. It had come about way earlier. The concept, our board president, Walter Grounds pitched this to ASHRAE a while ago, and it finally came to fruition. Myself and Graham Wright from Phius are on the committee. If anyone's been involved in an ASHRAE committee, it's a slow process, but I think it's a really valuable one. So basically, we're trying to bring together all of the concepts of the existing passive building standards out there, to a committee that has people from all backgrounds, and write this in code adoptable language. So in code enforceable language, non-proprietary standards that any jurisdiction can adopt, and also any software tool could support. So it's really just trying to open it up. And I'm really, really optimistic about where we're at. It is moving slowly. I think it's actually moving faster than many ASHRAE standards, but it's still really slow. But I'm optimistic because we have people from all corners, really, of the world on this, and all different mindsets. And you're kind of bringing all the cooks into the kitchen intentionally to make a really good recipe book, really for everyone else to move forward. And I think it's going really well. Really thoroughly thinking through some of the various components of the Phius standard, PHI standard. Some of that stuff is going into indirectly, going into the 227P. So we're not reinventing the wheel necessarily on everything. All of the same concepts are going into the standard. It's just going to come out, a little bit differently. It's going to go into an internal ASHRAE review, I think, by the end of the year, by 2022. There should be an advisory public review next year. And we're optimistically thinking 2024, there will be a version that could be adoptable. And I think it's optimistic, but I'm going to be optimistic about it. I think there's a lot of people really pushing to get this done, and putting a lot of time and effort into this. But it's a voluntary committee. So it's hard to compete with everyday work. And luckily, everyone in the passive building world is busy because, it's intentional, but so it makes it a challenge, but it's been going really well.
Yeah. And when you say all the cooks, I mean, you have leadership of Phius there, leadership of Passive House Institute there, and then other, heavy hitters.
Yep.
Probably internally at ASHRAE, I would imagine.
Yep. So there's liaisons from other committees like 90.1, 90.2, 189, like all the other, because, the things that aren't related to passive building, it makes sense to kind of just take what others have done in other committees and kind of plop that in there, or maybe make it a little bit, more stringent or something. But we're really, since we have to cover everything, we're trying to really focus on the new content being related to passive building and really high performance building, and then just grab stuff from other committee or other standards.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, it's great to hear that you're feeling optimistic about it, and it is a really exciting project. And so I think we'll all be on pins and needles until 2024, or
and then you can read the hundreds of page documents the night it comes out. Right? Yeah, exactly.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's going to be so much technical heft behind that. I mean, that's what ASHRAE is about. So.
Yep.
So you mentioned how busy everybody is, and I think that which brings up this. I mean, things are taking off. We look at the graphs of Phius certified projects or projects that are on the docket, and it's an exponential curve, which is awesome. So are there any kind of like general trends you're seeing in terms of adoption of Passive House? Are there certain building types or markets that are taking off? Just a little survey would be awesome.
Yeah, definitely. Affordable multifamily, I think by far and away is still the leader. And I do think a lot of that is due to incentive programs and QAPs. Like I can't even begin to explain how much that policy has driven the market there. In
QAP
great ways.
Being the qualified allocation program is a criteria for awarding low-income housing tax credits, which is a key way to fund projects, just for people who...
No. Good point. I'm throwing out acronyms. And even in places that had incentive programs that don't anymore, it was enough to spark, that into design firms and whatnot, and it takes off. So I really think that is the biggest place we're seeing growth. We're starting to get more in the South, but if you look at anywhere in the country relative to the Northeast, they're dwarfed by what's happening in Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New York, Connecticut.
Right. All places that have progressive policy around this.
Chicago did.
As a Northwesterner, that's frustrating.
Yeah, as a Chicago, Illinois, or Midwesterner. We actually have a new energy transformation code that should be adopted in a month or so, that Phius 2021 is an alternate compliance path for. So nice. Chicago's stepping up in a big way. This code will be a big jump for the city. So looking forward to that. But
that's awesome.
We're still behind.
Well done. Yeah. That's good that there are some leaders to follow. So that's awesome. Well, how about what's next? I mean, what's next for Phius? What's next for you? What do you see on the horizon here?
Yeah, it's tough. For Phius, I kind of see I've kind of always seen the organization as two different like main purposes. The one is kind of to educate and disseminate the knowledge that we're collectively like organizing from people doing this type of work all over the country, the world. And I think there's a really, really big place for that in the future. Just continuing to educate, train. Like if we look at the number of professionals we have and then the number of professionals actually working on the building delivery process, like we're still a really, really small part. So continuing to be that kind of hub for education and maybe growing the offerings we have with education, getting into more workforce development, trades, developers, like people outside of architects, engineers, builders, and commissioners. I think there's a really big part for that, because I think the research with like the standards and the technical solutions, there's, I feel like people have those down pretty well and they're working, and the proof of concept is working. People have figured out unique financing structures to make this work at very little upfront cost. But like the people that are ready to do this, execute this in the field, as much, we need more. So I think education, continuing to develop that and actually ramping that up will be big. And then I also see Phius kind of continuing to stay on what I would call like the front edge, or kind of more I don't know the words, the front edge of the research, like continuing to push the boundary, right? As to what does high performance mean? What do we need to do in the building sector? And I think a lot of that's going to come in with the Revive pilot for retrofitting buildings. And then also this kind of load flexibility concept. And how does that fit into the renewable future, microgrids, like continuing to try to dive into that, learn as much as we can, and disseminate that as well. So kind of both ends. I think project certification will continue. I mean, continue at the growth rate it is. If it goes into codes, there's a question of, do we even need to certify? Like, do we need a certifying body? Maybe not. I mean, and that's fine. Maybe we train local code officials to what we're doing, expand our certification knowledge as much as we can. That's the goal. So if we reach that goal, that's great. And for myself, it's a great question. I think I would hope to be kind of a little bit everywhere, kind of like I am now. It's fun. I really enjoy training. I really enjoy developing that type of educational content. I really enjoy research, and I also really enjoy like going to conferences and talking to other like-minded people and getting the concepts out and continuing to try to spread passive building and make it more mainstream. So continuing to lead this organization as it evolves and trying to keep the wheels on
community. Yeah.
It's kind of how I think of it. Yeah, supporting our other departments, right, to make sure everybody has what they need to keep their stuff moving forward. That's kind of where I'm at now, and it's fun. Yeah.
Well, we're all fortunate that you're doing the work, and thank you for your time today to talk with me. I really appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up our conversation?
Looking forward to the co-sponsored after party at PhiusCon.
Woo-hoo! That's going to be fun.
Me too. Alliance and Accelerator. Yeah. No,
yeah,
thank you for having me. This has been great. Thanks for all the work you and the Accelerator are doing. It's awesome. So much content. I try to listen to all of it. It's so much. It's great. So
it's okay.
Thank you.
No pressure.
And that was Lisa White. Great interview. Thanks, Zack.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Yeah, what did you think?
I really enjoyed listening to Lisa. I really great story about her journey and sticking with the organization, growing it from when she started out as an intern from 2 to 3 people now to be over 20, and going strong, doing some really, really great stuff. Energy engineering, as she described it, I can relate to this. She found that it was all about generation and capacity in the networks, and it can be quite a shift to move away from what you've been taught to thinking differently and realizing that something like Passive House does change that focus away from not being just about generation, but a lot about timing of demand. So not just reducing demand, but when you're talking about electricity grids, the key factor there is peak demand. So that's really exciting development for Passive House, because a Passive House flattens the demand curve of energy consumption. It doesn't just reduce it, but it just makes it a lot more flatline. I often joke about people who monitor their passive houses, and the output of that monitoring is typically really, really boring, which indicates that the house is performing really, really well, because you're not getting these big peaks and troughs in temperature or relative humidity, and that means that you're not having to turn on heaters and or air conditioning to compensate for that. So if everyone did that, then that has a massive impact on the amount of infrastructure, because the distribution infrastructure has to be big enough to deal with the maximum load that it's required, which is often a much, much greater load than the average. So if network providers can bring down that peak demand, it's a huge saving for the infrastructure investment.
Yeah, absolutely. Last night on PhiusCon Accelerator Live, we had Skylar Swinford on talking about, among many things, the Falcon curve, which is, and people have probably heard of the duck curve, the CAISO duck curve, which shows the kind of demand on the grid and how that electricity generation and demand and the mix and what's happening in California with a lot of solar production in the middle of the day, and then the Falcon curve looks at the basically the demand on the electricity grid over the course of 12 months, and shows that residential, if we were to electrify all residential heating right now, and we just did it in an inefficient way. So basically, like if we just transition to electric resistance heat, it would create these massive wing-like spikes in January on the left side of the curve of the graph, and in December on the right side of the graph, showing just that huge impact of all of that heating that happens in the winter on the electricity grid. But because we know how to do energy efficiency through Passive House, we have the opportunity or the ability, if we as society are smart, to bring those two wings down a whole bunch through energy efficiency, and get much closer to that flat. So that this idea, this understanding of winter heating peaks as the big problem to address around what you're saying in terms of spikes in demand is becoming, I think, more and more understood and widely recognized. So I think there's an opportunity then to say, hey, we've got a solution, guys.
And I really like the idea that Lisa brought up of zero grids as opposed to zero houses, where the concept is that a group of houses works together. So instead of you achieving a zero net house, you have houses that are smart or have some smart connectivity that allows one house with some excess capacity, maybe that happens to be on four wheels that's parked in the garage, an electric car that's effectively a battery on wheels, could be helping to power a house next door when it needs it, and then vice versa. And then as a small microgrid or a neighborhood could be net zero, but still people are using power or generating power, and that power's moving around in that isolated area. That's a much different model for power grid operators than the traditional model of one direction coming in from a main transmission down to a local grid and then just being consumed by the houses. So it's a really exciting space to see that, and it's a combination of efficiency of the buildings, but also some intelligence in metering and connectivity and adding batteries to that mix. But none of that's going to work if we don't also do something to reduce the demand as well, because it relies on those demand curves being flattened. So really exciting stuff. And I guess going back to Lisa's engineering roots, I like the idea that she seems to always be thinking beyond just Passive House and thinking about the sort of the wider implications this from a technical point of view, but also obviously from a social point of view. And similarly, I really liked her thoughts on the role of their organization in, she summarized it as being about education and certification, which I can relate to in the work that I do now at the Green Building Council. Right. That's a big focus. Is certification is really, really important because it shows that someone is verified. Same way as a certified passive house means a lot more than and someone who just we sort of use Passive House as a guide, because it's been checked, it's verified, and there's a good chance that they've actually hit or gone beyond the targets that are required, so they hit those performance requirements. But education is a huge part as well, and they go hand in hand. We need to educate people so they can get certified, but also the desire to get certification recognition also drives a demand for learning and and training, and not just the architects and designers, but also the tradespeople and the architects and the whole industry to upskill. So I could really relate to that combination of education and certification.
Yeah, indeed.
And she went on to talk about the future of organizations, even looking at, and I, at the top of the show, I talked about the possibility of, in Scotland, adopting passive house or close to passive house standard. And one thought is to think, well, if that happens, then would there still be a need for passive house organizations who are there to promote and advocate and sort of seen as the underdog sometimes. And Lisa was very positive about that. She said, yeah, even in the best case scenario where the passive house standard or something equal to it was effectively the building code, there would still be a huge role particularly on that education front, to assist with the industry, but also to help maintain those standards and to assist with new technologies. We've still got this huge challenge of what we do with existing buildings. So there's definitely no shortage of work, even in that best case scenario.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the thing that is important to remember is that we're in a time of so much flux and change. It was so, and that was something that came up again, in the conversation last night as well, is that when you think about the clean energy transition, we're still in early days. Our electrons on the whole are still quite dirty. That's going to be changing over time, where we're going to be shifting to cleaner and cleaner electricity. We also have refrigerants now that have massive global warming potential impacts that hopefully will be also changing the embodied carbon of the building materials. Right now, it tends to be very high. Over time, that's going to change. That's going to shift too, as there are innovations in materials, but also just the energy that goes into those making those materials will be cleaner. So. And then you have like the role of efficiency in buildings and where to invest money to decarbonize buildings in the most optimal way possible. And because all of that is changing, 10 years from now, the conversation about what metrics need to be hit and all this, I'm sure there's going to be things that are through lines that will remain consistent, but there's going to be tons of change. And so we need to have smart people like Lisa and others working on continually working on thinking about how the world has changed, and therefore how our response in buildings needs to be refined. So it's kind of like when you get into it and you think about like, well, how do you project the operational carbon of a building over in the future? That's a question that has all, like, there are a lot of unknowns there because things are shifting so quickly in so many ways. So it's exciting.
It is exciting. And something else that people are working on is the ASHRAE passive building standard.
Yeah, 227P.
227P, which I vaguely rings a bell. I may have been aware of. Started. This is relatively new. Approved, the ASHRAE committee approved that kind of initial stages of that in 2019. So it's work in progress, but that's really exciting. I mean, ASHRAE, it's an American American organization, but it does get referenced globally. And if you look deep enough into the building codes here in New Zealand, also Australia, and then the clauses, and then the standards that those clauses reference, a lot of roads lead back to ASHRAE standards. So they are very, very powerful. So to have the prospect of a passive building design standard developed by ASHRAE is really exciting.
It is, and I think what is also super exciting about this is that there is technical leadership coming from both Phius and PHI in the process. So there's the really deep scientific conversation and discussion happening at ASHRAE with ASHRAE's experts and PHI experts and Phius experts and others to hammer out what this should be. And it's encouraged. It's great. That's important work. And you're right. I mean, I think that the impact could be big, because this could be something that would be really easy for state code councils to adopt in their rules, and local cities to adopt, and it would have gone through this really rigorous process at ASHRAE, and therefore would, I think, have a lot of people would really trust. They should trust Phius and PHI too. But ASHRAE has a whole different kind of heft and authority. So
awesome. So we're going to see Lisa at PhiusCon.
Yes, indeed. And so Lisa and James Ortega are both going to join us. This is a good segue. Are both going to join us at the Passive House Accelerator live event on Wednesday in North America. So it'll be Thursday in New Zealand and Australia, but it will actually be Wednesday your time, because you're going to be with us in Chicago.
That's right.
Yeah.
Exciting stuff.
Yeah, so Lisa and James and I think Ilka and some other presenters from who will be presenting at PhiusCon will be joining us for this special in-person episode. Well, it's in person for us. It's going to be online, so I'm not explaining this very well, but it's a traditional Zoom
Passive Accelerator
live. Yeah, exactly. The CO2. Sorry. But we're going to have at Farr Associates at Doug Farr's office, which is a block away from the Hotel Palmer where the conference is happening. We're going to have a number of people come into. We'll have this little live studio where we're going to do brief interviews with Lisa and James and Ilka and I think 3 other folks who are going to share some insights about the presentations they'll make at Phius. So if you're not able to come to the PhiusCon conference, you'll be able to get some kind of high level points from what's going to be shared there. So please join us for that next week. We're gonna have a lot of fun. While I'm on the topic of announcements, I also want to let folks know that Matthew and Mary James and I will be doing conducting a series of interviews for the podcast at PhiusCon, and I want to give a big thank you to StoCorp and Zola Windows for underwriting that work and for making it possible for Matthew to join us in Chicago.
Yeah, much appreciated.
Big thank you to Stowe and to Zola, and also a big thank you to the folks who have underwritten the after party. So the after party, which happens on Friday, it is sold out. I am sad to say, but it's going to be a fantastic party. With Phius, it's the Phius Alliance and Passive House Accelerator after party. And it is sponsored by 475 High Performance Building Supply, Icon Windows and Doors, Inotech Windows and Doors, Partel, Proseco, and Source 2050. And thanks to their generosity, the tickets that were $125 a piece are now only $40. So when you're enjoying those cocktails at that party, raise a glass to the folks who made it so accessible. It's going to be packed and super fun. So
awesome.
What else? And then, of course, there's the Passive House Trust conference that's going on as well next week. So we'll include links to all this in the show notes.
Very good. All right. Thank you very much, Zack.
Thank you, Matthew.
Look forward to, it's going to be a great time. So looking forward to catching up in person and meeting up with all those great people. But we will be back on the podcast as well. Somehow, somewhere, we'll get an episode out in amongst all that.
Yeah, we will. It'll be fun.
All right. Thank you very much. We will be back again next week on Passive House Podcast.